How's it going, you guys? Michael Shamelin here, and in this video we're going to talk about ISO. It's a bit of a polarizing setting, I feel, for photography. A lot of people will stick to the lowest possible ISO 100 for everything. And I'm certainly not that person because it's very dependent on your subject, your conditions, and your overall situation. So I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to make a video about this and show you a bunch of different examples of different ISOs that I've used for my photography over the years. And in here, I'll also share some examples of images that I don't even think would have been possible at ISO 100. All right, so starting with an image taken at the base of Mount Whitney during spring. This was captured last year, and it may look like a very nice, calm day. You might be wondering, why in the world are you using ISO 500 here? Well, there's a few factors for this. The first being it was windy. Every single day that I tried to capture these lupin, it was windy. So I had to account for that and make sure that my shutter speed was high enough to be able to get these flowers nice and crisp, especially this little ladybug that was just kind of hanging out here. Now, the other factor here is I'm fairly close to these flowers, and I wanted to get all of them in focus into the background. So I had to use hyperfocal distance, which if you don't know how to do that, I have a video for it right here. But basically, I used hyperfocal distance to get everything relatively sharp from the background to the foreground. And what really helped me to do that is bumping my f-stop to f16, because any lower than that, and I wasn't able to get all these flowers in focus. And you might be asking, what about a focus stack? Well, it would have been very challenging with the wind. I made that mistake the year prior, and I spent hours in Photoshop manually stacking images of flowers together. It was miserable. I learned my lesson, and I decided if it was ever going to be windy and I was shooting wildflowers, I would try and get it all in one shot. The second base ISO on my Sony A1 is ISO 500, so this was absolutely perfect to get enough light into the camera to compensate and do the rest of the settings. For an image like this, it was pretty much my path to least resistance here and gave me a relatively clean shot overall. Now, if you do end up bumping your ISO and seeing a lot of image grain, I'll show you a very simple fix here in Lightroom later on. All right, so here's another example taken in the Texas swamps, this time using the same ISO 500 combination, and you'll notice I have a very quick shutter speed here. So I ended up shooting this from a kayak, and it was a lot of fun, very challenging though. I didn't have stability to be able to put down a tripod, and the water at this spot was way too high to be able to jam a tripod in there. So for this one, I had to compensate by doing 1/500th of a second at 250 millimeters. This is kind of my general rule of thumb. I like to double my shutter speed, whatever the focal length is. You can get sharp shots lower than that, but I find especially if I'm in a moving vehicle or there's wind or it's a challenging shoot where I have to move around a lot, even doing that, I can get some pretty blurry shots, especially when zooming into 100. And then for this one, I'm also doing a very high f-stop because again, I'm trying to get as many of these trees in focus as possible. If I was to shoot something like f6.3 or f5.6, these background trees would have been really soft, and for me that ends up being a bit of a distraction to this composition. All right, so funny enough, this next example was taken at ISO 100, and this was one of the few times on the swamps where I was able to stand on the ground and use my tripod. There wasn't any wind, so I was able to get a nice clean long exposure here. Pretty similar conditions, honestly, shooting backlit trees, but in this case, it was kind of the ideal situation for doing ISO 100. Moving on to something that looks very peaceful, but was actually very extreme. This was captured from a helicopter. I gotta say, this was the most turbulent helicopter ride I've ever had. If you've flown in a helicopter before, especially doors off, you know just how windy it is. The helicopter's already vibrating like crazy, and then you just add this turbulence of getting knocked around and dropping like 10 feet at a time. I was terrified capturing this photo right here. But I made the mistake of a previous helicopter ride, shooting my shutter speed too low, and some of my shots came out blurry, especially shots that I really liked. And in this case, I found that doing like 1/160 or 1/200th was perfect for getting nice, clean, sharp images, especially with my 16-35 wide-angle lens. This was also using my Nikon D850, so at the time I didn't have in-camera stabilization to work with. But with this one, I ended up doing ISO 400 to compensate for, which is my lowest f-stop, and I was shooting everything at infinity, so the f-stop didn't really matter. The most important thing here to dial in and get this shot was my shutter speed. Nothing else really mattered that much. If I was going to get a touch more grain to shoot at ISO 400, it's okay. I would have rather that than had to shoot 50 frames and hope and pray that one of them is in focus, because this isn't a moment that I'm going to experience again. So it was crucial that I used the settings that were going to work to get me the shot. We're going to switch it again, this time a waterfall long exposure. I find most of my waterfall shots I can usually do at ISO 100, especially when they're long exposures. But in this case, just doing a clean long exposure, f11 to get all of it nice and sharp, and then ISO 100. But there are those cases where I do have a hectic waterfall shoot, and this is the perfect example of one. This was captured in New Zealand, and it was shot from a boat. So another moving vehicle here, and this was a really windy day. I mean, the waterfalls were like blowing upwards because of 50, 60 mile per hour winds. It was also really dark and stormy on this day, so I had to take my Nikon D850 and bump this to ISO 1000. I probably could have gotten away with ISO 800, but either way, it was going to be pretty similar here. I used my lowest possible aperture to get more light into the camera, and then we've got 1/500th of a second here at 200 millimeters. Now, the cool thing about this shot is the wind was blowing the waterfall to show all of these cool textures, so doing a long exposure I don't think would have looked as interesting anyways, so I needed to make sure to freeze that water, and 1/500th of a second was perfect to get the water nice and crisp here. Even with the minor amount of manual noise reduction I did, this still looks pretty good. I'm super happy with this shot, but if I felt like it was too grainy, I could go back with denoise, because when I processed this one, denoise didn't exist yet. Moving on to dunes, one of my favorite subjects. Here's a situation where it was ideal. This was a beautifully calm morning in Death Valley, no wind. I was sipping my coffee, clicking long exposures, and not a care in the world. So, naturally, ISO 100, f9, and 1.3 second exposure. And I didn't have any subjects here that needed a shorter exposure than this. Maybe if there was some people on the dunes or some birds flying by, I would then have to bump my ISO to compensate and get that lower shutter speed. But in this case, it was perfect. But funny enough, how things can change in a day. Here are the dunes with some wind. I had sand constantly hitting me in the face, and it was really, really windy. So in this case, I did ISO 400 to give myself that breathing room. You're seeing a trend here, f11, and then 1/800th of a second. Again, another situation where long exposures weren't possible, and I just wanted to get the photo nice and tack sharp. Here's a shot from the redwoods taken on my tripod, ISO 100, f16 to get everything nice and sharp, and 0.5 of a second. This was the perfect, ideal situation. I think I was just sipping coffee and chatting with people on the trail and snapping beautiful pictures. But again, things can change pretty fast. So the next day, I was trying to shoot down at this foliage right here, and suddenly some wind started blowing in the forest, and I had to do ISO 500 to make sure that these plants would stay nice and crisp at 1/60th of a second. I also did f10 because that was the f-stop I needed to get pretty much all of this in focus. I found that any less than that, and these lower clovers ended up becoming blurry here. Luckily, I didn't need to do f16 or anything like that, or the shot might not have been possible without bumping the ISO even higher. And now what about having multiple moving subjects in the frame? Here's about one of the most fleeting moments I can think of, capturing that sunball hitting the horizon. This moment happened so fast, and to add an extra layer to it, this bird was flying by. So I made sure to, again, bump my ISO to 500. f6.3 was the lowest I could go on this lens, and then 1/800th of a second to make that double my focal length. And if I zoom in here, this is an example where my shot was a bit grainier. It was mainly due to me having to raise the exposure here. If I pull this back, you can see the original exposure was very dark because I was trying to get the perfect balance for the sun here. I knew that I could increase the shadows more than I would be able to recover those highlights. So you can definitely see more grain here. I'm also cropping this image a bit too, but luckily it's very, very easy to clean this image up. You just click on denoise right here. I usually use anywhere from 20 to 30% for my images. And here's the DNG example of the shot cleaned up. And if I scroll between the two, You can see it does a pretty good job cleaning up the image here. If you needed any more, of course, you could bring in some manual noise reduction. Another situation where I wasn't going to risk not getting the shot for just a slightly cleaner file, which of course, after applying the Lightroom denoise, didn't even really matter. Now, what about pushing the ISO really high, like 800, 1600, and even 6400? Well, luckily, I don't have to do that often with regular landscape photography, but astrophotography is kind of another story here. So anytime you're shooting the Milky Way, moonlit landscapes, sometimes you will need to push your ISO a lot higher. Now here's an example that's one of my oldest astrophotography shots. I think this one was captured in 2013 with my Canon 6D. So the technology that was in that camera sensor was certainly not as good as what's available today, but this was a single exposure, and I just silhouetted this tree against the Milky Way. I did ISO 4000, f3.2 because I think the lens that I was using at the time wasn't very good at 2.8. And I just used manual noise reduction in Lightroom and in Photoshop, so this wasn't using denoise or anything like that. Now after this point, I started using more techniques to try and reduce the noise in my night sky photography. Here's an example right here taken at ISO 6400. Funny enough, this was taken with the Canon 5D Mark III, but this one was a panoramic shot. So it's 4 vertical images to get this panoramic view, and what that allowed me to do is get a larger picture and reduce the noise. So even though we're at 6400 ISO, I mean, for an old camera like this and one of my older astro shots, it still looks pretty good in my opinion. I mean, I've printed this thing out really large, I've sent it to multiple clients for commercial work, and yeah, I still look back at this image with really fond memories. So I'll show you just one more astro photograph, and you'll notice this one's a bit cleaner than the previous two, and that's because I had just purchased my tracker back in 2014. So this was shot in 2014 here, and I'm doing ISO 6400, but I'm tracking the Milky Way, and then I'm stacking it with about 10 exposures, turning the tracker off, and then stacking 10 exposures for the foreground here. But since it was 10 years ago, I was still using my Canon 6D. So even if you're using an older camera system, you can still get some really great quality out of your night sky work if you're willing to put in a few extra techniques, like perhaps tracking the sky or using stacking, which I have a tutorial for also right here. Okay, so a lot of image examples here, but this just gives you my thought process when it comes to ISO. If I can use ISO 100, great, I'll definitely do that. But more often than not, I find myself needing to push that ISO, and it's never really stopped me from getting a shot that I'm happy with, even with the older camera systems. And now I'd love to hear from you. Do you have an idea for a video or tutorial you'd like to see me cover on the channel? Please let me know in the comments. As always, I really appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more. And if you want to learn more from me, I will put a link to my website in the description where you'll find tutorials and workshops. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next one.